Hello everyone, and greetings as always to this congregation of interesting and interested people. I feel confident in saying that. It's time for a conversation with an interesting and interested person. Today's guest, honestly, you're going to love the conversation that unfolds, I'm quite sure, because she is a person who radiates calm and reason, and you can tell just by listening to her that she has thought deeply about what she's about to say. But before we get into that, let me just attract your attention to my patreon.com site. It's by going there and signing up and spending a little bit of cash. It equates to the cost of a cup of coffee every month. You practically and meaningfully support the work that we try to do here. In return, you get early access to my new content and exclusive access to my question and answer session, which is a bit like a live conversation between thee and me. Anyway, it's a great site, so come along, join up, stir yourself into the mix and make the whole thing better by having you there. Okay, now for the aforementioned interview. Hi everyone. It's time once again for a conversation with an illuminating, inspirational person. I would say in this increasingly, in fact, never-endingly confusing world, simply finding people to trust is a challenge. It's becoming tougher all the time. A bizarre aspect of the past few years for me has been the way in which we've been told, really from the highest levels, to discard out of hand the testimony of those who won't trot out the state-sponsored ideology, narrative, whatever. And one of those stubbornly dissenting voices is my guest today, Dr. Clare Craig. Lovely to see you there, Clare. How are you?
I'm very well, Neil. Thanks for having me on.
Good. I'm actually going to read out, I was looking for background information about you, as one does, and I'll just read some of this bio for you that I found on Amazon, actually. Dr. Clare Craig, BM, BCH, FRC Path, studied medicine at Cambridge University, moving to Oxford for her final 3 years of clinical training. After qualifying, she practiced in the NHS for 15 years, specialising as a diagnostic pathologist and becoming a Fellow of the Royal College of Pathologists. Subsequently, she was the day-to-day lead for pathology and clinical data in the cancer arm of the 100,000 Genomes Project and worked in AI cancer diagnostics. And then the bio takes a little twist. From May 2020, she has worked full-time pro bono on COVID research, distilling the evidence for a lay audience. Since January 2021, she has co-chaired HART with Dr. Jonathan Engler. HART Health Advisory and Recovery Team is a multidisciplinary body of experts who have provided an independent source of information on COVID issues. Despite attempts to smear her, supported by government, she has continued speaking out and remained a consistent voice of reason and calm throughout the COVID era. Clare, a consistent voice of reason and calm is how you've always struck me. Can you just describe what it has felt like to go from your life and work of before all of this and how it is now? So much change.
So much change, absolutely. I mean, nothing that I could have predicted around this at all. You know, I was very career driven, I was successful, and I had ambitions in doing all of this AI work. That was what I was expecting. That's what I was going to be doing. And things, didn't work out that way, but not in a kind of, the way you presented it, it sounded like I sort of knew what was happening straight away and I was going to do this big switch, and it wasn't like that at all. I started to have concerns not until summer 2020. So throughout spring 2020, I was scared and fell for most of it, like everyone else. And in the summertime, the way the diagnostic testing was being handled was clearly nonsense, and I could prove it was nonsense, and so I spoke out about it then, and got a reception that I wasn't anticipating. So instead of being told that I was wrong or that I was right and that they'd do something about it, I was treated as a danger, or I was treated really badly. People sort of came under attack, which I did not anticipate at all. And that period of being under attack, hasn't really ended in some ways, but it was worst in 2021. And yet, actually, throughout that period, I found myself being introduced to brilliant people who I've become, really, I've got really good friends that have come out of this, and people who have very, they're very principled, and they have really interesting backstories, and they have a, grasp of the detail that you don't see anywhere else, and they're not, their kind of drivers are not selfish at all, and so they're really brilliant people to be around. And so out of all that horror has come a lot of very positive things, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Although it's been hard throughout that time, I never felt like I could just drop it and go back and get a regular job and forget about it. I've never been able to. That idea was just impossible. It was impossible. And, what are we now, 4 years in? Never thought it would be 4 years. Every single point we were thinking it's nearly over, it's nearly over. Still think that now. Who knows how many more years we've got to go. But I can't just walk away from it now.
Someone sent me saying something actually in November 2021 in front of an audience. And I just, out of curiosity, I listened to myself speaking in November 2021, and I was shocked, because I was saying then, because I had learned from people like yourself, but what I was saying then, I could have been saying it today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I thought, it's been obvious. It was this obvious to me then, and I just consider myself a reasonable person. I'm no scientist, no specialist. I was just gleaning information as I went along. And yet, that's recently. It's the passage of time. The Together Declaration. I attended the 3rd anniversary of the Together Declaration, which is also a different but an associated product of all of this. And it's the way it's drawing out. I think it seems fair to say, surely, based on observation, that there's not going to be accountability for what's happened.
It really doesn't feel like that, does it? It doesn't feel like there is going to be. It doesn't feel like there can be. And sometimes when some people get justifiably angry about things and want to see criminal sanctions and that sort of thing, which I'd like to see for some of this as well. But when the conversation heads in that direction, I feel like anybody who's moderate immediately sticks their hands in their ears, because I think they feel like they went along with it too, that if they had been in a position of power, they'd have made the same mistakes. Then they don't sort of see, they can't view it through that lens. And then you sort of think about historical events where societies have had big problems, some bigger than the ones we've got now. And it only really resolves with the kind of peace and reconciliation type approach, where both sides, say they've done wrong, but the sanctions never come. They don't come in those scenarios. But I don't think you get any admission of guilt unless you say, we are going to have a sort of amnesty around it.
That said, because I'm very aware, obviously, because we've been having conversations like this for years, and we could go over and over and over. But that said, if there's to be no accountability, let's say, what are you working towards now? What understanding, I suppose? What beneficial result are you seeking now? Because you are doggedly continuing with HART, with the research, with listening to people, talking to people, asking questions. Where are you going to go with it?
Well, that's a great question. And what we've tried to do is become more focused with our ambitions. So, we started off with, we're going to persuade the politicians there's a problem, right? And then we'll go from there. Now, it didn't take too long to realise that doesn't work, that politicians follow the crowd. And so you have to persuade the crowd. So then we're like, well, we'll try and educate the public. And of course, we're massively censored. So that doesn't really work. And so then, it will work eventually, right? Because of this, what you're saying about the consistency of truth, that will work in time. But it's much harder than it needs to be because of the censorship. And so then you're like, well, what needs to happen so my children have a future in a free society? What can we do about that? And there are certain aspects of what has happened that really aren't about the science, it's about the ethics. So, the fact that informed consent and bodily autonomy was overridden such that the state had control over people's bodies is a massive Rubicon that's been crossed. And people aren't even admitting that it has been crossed. That step one is to say, well, that happened. That happened. And until you admit that that happened and should never have happened, we can't get into a world where it won't happen again. Things will just get worse and worse. And so there is this kind of need to be redrawing ethical red lines, or just restating them as they're being continually crossed, saying, no, you've crossed an ethical red line again and again and again, because unless we're calling it out and people do get that. I think that sort of there is something sort of inherent in humans around understanding about ethical breaches and that sort of natural law where what's right and wrong. People know it's wrong, but they're doing it anyway. And so we have to keep telling them it's wrong, because of where that heads otherwise.
Do you think? I actually wonder sometimes if they just can't stop. It feels as though for a long time the engine was running and the car was in gear for them. They were in fourth gear and they were moving forwards and they were getting somewhere. It now feels a lot of the time that they're in a kind of neutral, with everything spinning, but the gear's not meshed. The Northern Ireland bill, that was pushing for everything up to and including mandated vaccines. The fact that they still are inviting people to come and get these utterly discredited jabs. It's almost as if they just can't stop themselves, even though they're making less and less actual headway, because it feels like they aren't making headway, they're just making noise that upsets people.
Maybe they are. I mean, that sort of analogy is one that I'm using in my next book, this idea that you've got this kind of runaway train and it has no brakes, and it was built with no brakes because when some of these things were set up, people just wanted it faster and quicker and more and more and more, with no consideration about how you slow down, stop, or reverse. Like those things were never ever built into it. So if you make a vaccine strategy in the NHS and you get all of these people excited about it and you have all of these nurses and volunteers who are going to be doing the jabbing and you set up the clinics and blah 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 blah, you can do all of that and create this engine, but you haven't done anything about stopping that. Like how are you going to tell these people that actually that wasn't the best thing to do, or maybe we need to slow down, or can we take a bit more care about how we do this? None of that's factored in, and it's built in a way that it can't really be factored in, and so you've just let it loose. And as you say, they're running in neutral, they have no control over it. It's already out there, and it can't just be drawn back in, because as soon as they start to try and do that, they're shooting themselves in the foot. That's the problem. They have this sort of massive guilt complex, which ironically, had that been addressed ages ago, wouldn't have inflated the size that it is now. But it's so problematic now for them to say that any of this was wrong. But it's coming. It's coming. You think, surely these people are not so stupid to realise that it's better coming from them, that they have control of the situation if it comes from them. And we have started to hear a few voices expressing regret now. Very few.
It's utterly bizarre. It's like watching people who keep on killing people because if they stop, they'll be accused of murder in the past. It almost feels as if they have to keep doing it, otherwise someone will accuse them of having done it. Mm-hmm. It's beyond. It doesn't make rational sense to me. And you and I exchanged some messages earlier today, and you were suggesting that there's and it chimes with me, but you were suggesting there was a religiosity, that there is a religiosity about it, and I'd really like to get into that line of thinking, because it doesn't just relate to COVID.
No,
whatever at all. It's a state of mind, a way of life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the only real way to understand what's happened is through that lens, because it's the only thing that explains everything, right? So a lot of people try to see what happened and say, well, this happened because people wanted money. The pharmaceutical companies were influencing all of, they're influencing the medical journals, they're influencing the WHO and the regulators, and they're just out to make a fast buck. Now, obviously, that's all true. It's all true, but it can't explain why friends and family were rejecting the unvaccinated. And it can't explain why people refuse to listen to scientific debate on the subject. And why, people who were, there's tons and tons of people, professionals, who have sort of a tiny amount of responsibility in all of this. And they were all going along with it, and they weren't gaining financially. And there's a whole load of people, the people who attack me on Twitter, for example, some of them are paid and some of them are government sponsored, whatever, but they're not all. Some of them just care about this in a very deep way. And I think it all stems from the point that, at least the vaccine part of it does, from the way it's taught. We are taught as a society that vaccines are a modern medical miracle. That's the story, isn't it? They are a miracle, and that that they are saving lives all of the time. And so that very premise of the vaccine, it has this status that no other drug has. That word gives it a status that no other drug has. And you can make a very strong argument about why these products should never have been called that in the first place. And you can track the changes of the definition of the word vaccine in order to incorporate these products. But the point is that the vaccines themselves are treated as somehow sanctified. And so you get into a position where people who are saying things that are critical of any one vaccine are treated like blasphemers. Which they are. It's not just a sort of they're annoying or they're wrong. They are completely shut out of the conversation, and people want to jail them. We've had a threat of jailing in terms of the people who are anti-vaxxers should be in prison type story.
I was struck terribly just this week about the death of Jackie Stone. I think she was Zimbabwe. I think it's Southern Africa. I can't remember if it was South Africa or Zimbabwe, but she had been this trenchant, dissenting voice, and campaigning and insisting on her right to practice medicine the way she wanted to practice medicine, and now she's gone, and she's taken her own life, and we're actually at a point where heretics are actually being destroyed. Not just reputationally, and not just socially, but physically. And I wonder, we're always told all the time that we are driven by progressive ideology. And in what sense are we progressing at all? If we're almost back in the Inquisition.
Yeah, totally, absolutely. The story around Jackie Stone is horrible, horrific tragedy. And as you said, she was a really passionate voice, and she really made an impact. And she just hosted this conference in Zimbabwe a few weeks before. And the film came out that I watched of it, and it was really uplifting. This was a sort of real positive view of things. And so it was particularly galling to see what happened to her in such a short time after that period.
So how have we got to? I agree completely. When that idea of religiosity, a religion, and science became the church, and to speak against the church was heresy. How did we get here?
So I think
what process?
There are so many elements to it, and the time frames of these elements. Some of them are very, very long. And so, we've had a situation which has really been over sort of 100 years. It's not short, of science becoming more and more institutionalized. Science used to be paid for by benefactors, and you'd have the scientists who'd be very, very free to do whatever research they were interested in, with no real restrictions on what they were discussing. And this is sort of back in the Victorian era type thing. And when scientists were discussing things, anything goes at that point. They were very, very open-minded, and you'll find that a lot of the big names in science had some really quite wacky interests in terms of hypnosis or in seances, all sorts of, because that was fine. You could be brilliant at one thing and have a wacky view on another thing. And the reason that people had both is because they were open-minded people. And there was this culture of allowing open-mindedness then. And then over time, we've had these institutions build up, and then the funding has become more and more centralized, and then more and more government control over the funding, although it's not really the government so much as the people who are holding the purse strings in any particular domain will have vested interests. And so they don't want some upstart, who's going to potentially show that their life's work, some of it was wrong. That's the problem we have, is that you're not going to then fund the new knowledge because it will expose scientists as being wrong. So fundamentally, the problem we've got is that we have scientists who think they are right about everything. And that's upside down. Scientists are meant to be living in the domain of the wrong. The way you do science is to say, let's go find out what else we're wrong about. That's what science is. It's about looking into what's wrong and proving yourself wrong again and again and again until you've learned. So that's how you learn. But we live in a world where scientists are scared of being wrong, which is insane. It's insane. But you end up with these sort of scientific high priests who then preach as if there's no uncertainty, and then obviously make utter fools of themselves in doing so, because there's always uncertainty.
Is there no nonconformist faith? To stretch the religious analogy, you'd expect that, as you say, people like, I don't know, Isaac Newton called himself an alchemist till his dying day, and Charles Darwin attended seances and investigated spirituality, and the brothers that did likewise on the grounds that they ought to be investigating phenomena and supernature in the same way that they were applying the scientific technique to everything else. It's hard to have these to follow the Darwinian line. Have these people just been evolved beyond? Has science created an ecosystem that's inhabited by people that ironically aren't scientists in their
I think
desire to be wrong?
I think that is what's happened. That they're power-driven people. And that's not really compatible with science. Money and power they corrupt what science is about, really. And so we have created that ecosystem, and it's hugely problematic. And it's been going on for long enough that we are potentially, if things go right, if things go right and we take a sort of sharp turn in the correct direction for whatever reason, then we could be on the cusp of a new kind of renaissance, because there's been such a period of interesting new things being suppressed that they could all just be released all at once, and it will be astonishing, because we will suddenly think, oh my goodness, we're learning things at a rate we've never learned before. And of course that's not true. It's just that they've been stored up, unable to be told. Those stories are unable to be told, and there's, I can prove this. I'm not just saying this as a kind of opinion. People have measured this. You can measure scientific breakthroughs by how often a particular paper gets referenced and for how many years it continues to be referenced, and that's because it became a turning point of some sort. And you can measure those turning points and say, well, how many have we had? And it's going down and down and down and down, because everybody's just sort of copying and repeating and doing the little details and not actually fundamentally undermining things, false beliefs.
So when you say that stuff's being sat on or suppressed, to what extent do you subscribe? Because I don't know what to think, because I don't see the relevant paperwork. But do you subscribe to the belief that there are cures, that there are advances, that there are technological innovations that are years ahead of what we're presented with at the moment, that are just kept out of the public domain because to bring that forward would turn off the money tap for the existing tech or the existing pill?
I don't know, but I can know that if there were those things, right? If they were those things, then the situation we have means that they wouldn't come to the front. So just to take something really, really simple in medicine, Drugs come from more than one source, and there's a huge number of sort of plant-based drugs from that we have no knowledge of in Western medicine, and that's always been the case. And so occasionally you might be able to find some new thing and test it out and find that it's got some brilliant function and benefit from it. So there is this huge resource of plant-based medicinals that have been neglected for a long time in a world where in the past, doctors could literally just find something and presuming it was safe, could try it out. So the barriers to being able to do a trial have got more and more, because that was how the regulators were controlling the pharmaceutical industry. We've got these pharmaceutical companies, we can't completely trust them, so let's make it so they have to follow this rule and that rule and have to set this up in this particular way, and they have to go to this committee for this, that, and the other. And what that means is that regular doctors don't have the resources anymore to do a trial. Only pharmaceutical companies do. So, that's one way of managing that problem, which has sort of backfired in terms of being able to look at generic drugs and look at cheap drugs and see what benefits we could gain from them. So the only way you can actually do a trial and show anything that's working is if it's got massive amounts of money behind it and is then profitable in the end. And so that's not good for people, right? For people, we want to know what the cheap stuff does. And we're in a situation where we just can't discover that. And where increasingly my peers in medicine seem to think that plant-based medicinals are inferior or dangerous or not worth investigating, which is just, that's just really ridiculous. It's really ridiculous. And obviously, if you've got a plant that's got multiple different compounds in it, you might want to pick out the ones that you're going to be interested in rather than create unnecessary side effects from the whole mix.
But that strikes even me as insane. I mean, digitalis, whatever, comes from foxgloves, and aspirin comes from willow bark, and these are like universal panacea. But penicillin it's not plant based, but it's a natural event.
Yeah.
But based on what do you start saying only the things that we make from oil and plastic are safe and efficacious, and anything that's been growing on the planet for millions of years is by definition to be avoided? How did we get there?
It's interesting, isn't it? How did we get there? And it's I remember at medical school I sort of went to a few meetings that were about these sort of plant-based medicinals. And the people that were attending these meetings were already at that stage, this is back in the late 1990s, they were considered sort of outliers and a bit fringe back then. So, already people were thinking that drugs had to be from pharmaceuticals only. That had to be the source of any kind of treatment. I don't know quite how you persuade doctors that there's more to medicine than pharmaceuticals, because it seems that everything's become that one-dimensional path. And I'm not saying there aren't good pharmaceuticals. I think there are, but it's just a tiny part of what medicine should be about. And that point can go. I could take much further. That medicine seems to have become very protocol-driven, where doctors are, just trying to feed people through algorithms and find the pill for every ill. And obviously, any old computer can feed things into algorithms. And so doctors are doing themselves out of a career by not bringing to the table something different. And, what doctors should be bringing to the table is their humanity and their ethics. That's what patients want from a person over a computer. Sure, let the computer decide on the drug. But, patients don't care about that. They care about somebody holding their hand and looking them in the eye and explaining things to them and just being there to navigate the system for them. And doctors, I feel we've sort of lost our way, and that actually is the important part of what we provide for patients.
It all feels like there having been a falling away from, the medical profession, the hospital and the hospitalers. It did come out of religious orders way back when, did it not? The people that were caring in whatever, we would regard it as primitive ways, but it was coming out of a faith, and it was vocational, and it was coming out of a calling,
Right.
and it feels as though in this somewhere in this inversion of religiosity, where we've begun to where we are worshipping science, and we are worshipping scientists as deities, as infallible. It's there's something there's an inversion has happened there, because it ought to be a calling,
Right.
but not about being worshipped because of what you know.
No, no. And there's that whole, that classic thing around doctors wanting to play God, which, as a medical student, you're kind of conscious of, and you try to make sure that's not you, but it's obviously a thing that you need to avoid at best. So there is this whole thing around around healing and where healing comes from. And obviously there was a time when healing was considered to come from God. And the Bible is very, very clear on when that goes wrong. And so I did this little exploration into the whole snake on a pole that represents medicine, right? The snake on a pole.
Asclepius and all of that.
Right, right. And the thing about it is that when people see that image, obviously they think it's medicine. It represents, used by all the medical societies, but it unsettles people. Doctors and patients alike are unsettled by that image. So, going through medical school, we would be asking, well, why have we got this snake on a pole? What's this thing about? And the answer we were told is that it was from this Greek tradition. And that was that. That just represents medicine. It's a Greek tradition. Shut up. And so I started digging into this. And the Greek tradition story is sort of true. There was this, I can't remember the name, I'm afraid, but there was this sort of cult in ancient Greece where they had these hospitals where the floors were covered in snakes, and people would come to be healed, and they would be put into this room full of snakes to sleep, and they would be visited in their dreams by some snake, and that would be the healing process. So not particularly warming.
Quite fringe, we would say.
Yeah, quite fringe, yeah. And if you go back a little bit further than that, you think, well, where did that idea come from? If you go right back to Moses, so Moses has a time in the desert with the Israelites where they're being bitten by snakes, and he prays about it, and then God tells him to lift this snake onto a pole and plant it, and when they're told when they're ill to look at the snake, and they'll be healed by God, right? And before long, some of these people are worshipping the snake on the pole. And there was a tribe of Dan in the north of Israel who were seafarers who were worshipping this snake on a pole, who may well have gone around the time to ancient Greece, and this belief of the snakes may have developed from that. But this idea that, it was very explicit in the Bible that this snake on a pole became a false idol. It was a false idol that the kings then had to, in the book of Kings, they destroy, because the people are not worshipping God for healing. They're worshipping the snake on the pole. And here we are in a world where people worship the snake on the pole for healing, don't they? It's, it's much more than just a way to, the way that medicine is treated is that it has powers beyond its ability, right? So I'm saying medicines do help people. They do. Surgery does help people, but it's often presented in a way that exaggerates the benefits, and that's where you get to the false idol aspect of it.
It sounds like which is not just anything to do with medicine, I suppose, but it's a loss of, or a lack of humility. No.
Yeah.
Where doctors in this instance are wanting to take unto themselves 100% of the credit, I suppose, for fixing the unwell person. And there's a lack of humility there, because there have to be other things going on at the same time, or the person is not going to be cured only by the efforts of the physician, are they? There has to be,
Absolutely.
There's more at play.
Absolutely, there is more at play. And it's not all doctors. There are some doctors who are very open about that and who will try very hard not to intervene and wait for the body to heal, because bodies do tend to heal. And there's that whole thing that everyone's familiar with when you go to a doctor with some condition, and by the time you've turned up, you're already better, and you feel like a bit of a con artist, because bodies are very, very good at healing, and time is very good at healing. And yes, there are occasions when you have to step in, which is why you watch your patient in that period. But it's not all of the time. And yeah, and I do think, I think the pharmaceutical companies are brilliant at marketing. They spend a huge amount of money on marketing, more than on research. And then unfortunately, a lot of doctors buy into their marketing claims, without being critical and thinking hard about what the drugs are. And I think in the past, doctors would have taken that upon themselves to properly understand. But because of the way that protocols have come into medicine and the way that things have become very top down in terms of decision making, then that decision feels like it not only isn't your responsibility anymore, it's someone else's responsibility, but that it's not clear how, if you think they're getting it wrong, you do anything about it. And nor is it clear who's actually accountable for these things. You'll have these things written, they're unauthored. So there isn't accountability. And if it doesn't suit your patients, or if it's harming your patients, there isn't debate, there isn't discussion. You're just told, do this. And then, of course, as a doctor, medicine's enormous. It's just enormous. And so, of course, you have to depend on others to help you guide your patients through it. I think that's completely reasonable to have help in practicing medicine. But if you find that one of these structures is undermined and that you can't trust them anymore, then your world falls apart because you can't do it on your own. And so I think that's part of the problem we have, is doctors wanting to remain in this fantasy that everything that comes top down is perfect and they can trust 100%, and they don't have to question or debate it.
Are there any reasons for being hopeful about a fundamental change of direction? The whole medical profession, one way or another, went through this. Went through it. And you've said, so many people, they've realised that it was wrong, and the loss of or ignoring bodily autonomy and all of the rest of it. Are you aware of people of like mind with you within who grudgingly or quietly have they learned that really that we crossed a Rubicon there, we must never be like that again? Has it shocked anyone out of it?
I'll give you the answer you want to hear, Neil. It's not the answer you want to hear. So the truth is that most of my medic contacts are still in 2020 frame of mind. Like they haven't moved on. They are still thinking that nothing went wrong, everything they did was fine. And they won't talk about it. It hurts them to talk about it. So I'm a problem to them because, when I'm with them, it's taboo subject. They will go around the table asking out people's jobs, what are you up to, how are you doing? And, we'll skip Claire, because we don't want to hear that. So, there is this real problem. They've still got their fingers in their ears. So there's that issue. Then there is a sort of next tier up of doctors who have known and understood this problem and they get it, but have never said anything publicly. And they're still not saying anything publicly. So there is still a problem, a huge problem there. And this is just another false idol in many ways. This is people who are idolizing their careers, and they are not necessarily worried about today. They're worried about the future, and they don't want to ever do anything to rock the boat because they just want to be, safe, secure. And obviously, safe and secure is a lie, isn't it? Because where's that leading them? Actually, if nobody will speak up about massive issues at a societal level, then you're not headed into a safe and secure place at all.
I don't understand because I just want to know. I just want to understand. When all this process started for me, I just wanted to know. I became aware that something wasn't. It wasn't right, and I just wanted to understand and to know. And I have gone through the really agonizing and frankly embarrassing process of realizing that so much of what I thought was wrong. But I want rid of it. I want to know the real truth. And the fact that it's imperiled me, I don't want a new car sitting outside the front and to continue to be inhabiting ignorance. I'd rather walk and know. I just want the knowledge. And that scientists and people like doctors aren't just desperate to know the real answer. I, I can't comprehend that.
I think part of that is with medicine. There was, even my dad's generation of doctors, people were very generalist. You'd be a general surgeon, you'd be a general physician, and you would see everything. And then as time went on, it became more and more specialist. And as it became more and more specialist, your world narrowed, your horizons narrowed, but you also got to a situation where there was this culture of respecting other people's expertise. So you would ask somebody else about your patient's heart and somebody else about your patient's lungs, and you just had to accept what those experts had to say to you. There was, that's their area. You don't tread on their toes, and that culture comes with enormous problems. So one of the problems is you lose all of your polymaths because there's people who just want to be focused on one thing that suits. And then if you've got somebody where there's a clash, there can be a clash between experts where what one person says doesn't make sense to the other. And I've been there, right? I've been in these situations multiple times, and all I'm doing is asking questions of them because it doesn't make sense to me. That's taken as an offensive thing. It's, instead of it being something that should be pique their curiosity, like, well, why can't I? How come I don't understand that? What is the foundational belief underneath that? It's just taken as an affront, as if I'm disrespecting their expertise. And so that's the culture that it comes out of. And so when you've got that culture and you're presented with the head of public health who says this, that, and the other, then you're like, well, I'm going to respect that because he's the expert, and then I don't have to engage my brain and think. And that's hard work. Who wants to do that?
But we'll never get ahead. The whole science is predicated on surely on the acceptance that we'll know more tomorrow than we know today, and that we know more today than we did yesterday. If you just decide that the book's closed now, that's it. We know it. That's it, done. Just read this version, this iteration of the book, and you can't go wrong. That just stops progress in its tracks.
Yeah, but the thing about progress is that progress happens in an uncomfortable way. It only happens when you've got lots of people vying for the truth in an open market. And that means there's confusion and contradiction. And it's uncomfortable for people who like to think they're right all the time. It's fine for science because that's, true scientists are very happy to be wrong, and they're loving this array of different choices, and let's find out where the truth lies. But most people really, really uncomfortable with that, really, really uncomfortable. They don't want a lot of options of what might be right, ever. They want to know an answer, and just don't give me any of that rubbish about uncertainty. I want to be told a nice, clean, safe answer to every question. And if it's wrong, I don't care as long as everyone else believes it. And I think those are the people we live with, Neil. That's what most of society, that's how they think. And it's actually more interesting maybe to look back historically and say, well, why were these pockets of time when that kind of thinking was allowed? What was different about those periods that enabled that flourishing, that allowed that to happen? And I think it comes from a position of well, actually, on the one hand, foundational belief in God. I think that's really, really important to allow that to happen, because if you've got a faith in God, you don't really care about these worldly things. You don't have faith in the worldly things. You're just curious about them. So you have to have some like foundation stone of faith to do that, and also a confidence. And if you think about these eras of progress in science, there was a confidence that in investigating and in our ability to learn, that I think we've lost somewhere along the way.
How is it for a doctor or a scientist to espouse a belief in God? Surely that in itself is very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
For a in inverted commas person of science.
Yeah. So I mean, obviously there are lots of doctors who believe in God. It's not new, but it's new for me because I've been a kind of ardent atheist for 20 plus years. Well, actually probably more like 30. And so that, I was, that is how the world's presented to you in medicine. Is, we can answer everything. we know everything, we can answer everything. Evolution explains everything to do with creation, and therefore there is no God. That's the story, and I believed it completely for all of that time. And the evolutionary story is a particularly interesting one because that's not answering all the questions, is it? It's about it's some of the questions, but the rest of the questions around spirituality just sort of got shelved. I'm not interested in that. It's not a question I want answered anymore. And
Yeah.
yeah. So, but that is it. It makes that again.
What happened to you? What happened to you? What happened to you, Claire? What happened after 20 years of ardent atheism? What happened?
Well, I started looking at the COVID stuff. It was all around the COVID stuff, this story. And there was that period in 2021, early 2021, which was the darkest period that I could describe to you, where London, where I lived, was silent. The buses were red with no posters on them anymore, and we were all locked down, not going out. And the TVs were getting hysterical all over again. And people were dying. People were dying on top of all of that. But there was this very spiritually dark, heavy feeling that something was incredibly wrong out there. And everybody felt it. They interpreted it in different ways. So most people felt that feeling and were scared of the virus. And I felt that feeling and I was scared of everything else but the virus. But I was properly uncomfortable with that place I was at. And around that time, I was being introduced to Christians. There were lots of Christian dissidents because of that thing, without them having that foundational faith, allowing them to think more freely. And they were they were really pissed off about the churches being locked. So there was that too. Anyway, they were saying, "Claire, are you a Christian?" I just kept getting this question: "Are you a Christian?" I said, "No." They said, "Oh, okay. Well, I'm praying for you." Right. So people kept saying they were praying for me, and I was like, "Okay, that's nice." Only it started to have an impact, this being prayed for. I started to feel completely at peace in a way that I hadn't since being a child. And then I was in this position of being completely at peace while the world was just more ridiculous than ever and I was under more attack than ever. I thought, well, this is strange. This is really strange. And then I started doing these kind of big prayers to no one type thing, where you're just despairing, really, but not to any particular God at that time. And then it became about what truth is. So as a scientist, truth is what you can prove with numbers and with measurements. And that's not how I see truth anymore. So what I was finding was that when I made mistakes, I'd make mistakes sometimes. And when I made a mistake, and it was a provable mistake, it would get massively shared. It would just go wild. Everybody would look at it because they could say, "Look at her, she's wrong, and this is why she's wrong." And when I said stuff that was provably true, but very much an inconvenient truth, the opposite would happen. And so I started to get this kind of sensor for how inconvenient truths were dealt with. And then I just started seeing so many parallels with the inconvenient truths around Jesus and how that was dealt with. It's very much the same story of suppression and of it's the same story, and so yeah, that led me there.
I can echo all of that. What I started getting, I felt that feeling that you described, that darkness, and actually for me, I realised. I don't think it was like Damascene or anything, but I gradually perceived that what I was feeling was the immanence of evil. I could feel it. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. And I thought, if there's evil, there must be the equal and opposite of evil. There must be good. And through that period as well, I was getting all these letters. I got these people started writing letters to me with no address, just to the coast guy near the castle in Stirling. And they were all coming by the 100, by the 1,000. And most of them mentioned faith. It was all about, I have my faith, or this is a spiritual battle. This is a battle between good and evil, right and wrong, God and the devil. It was it was a steady. It was a torrent at one point, and I thought I got acculturated by it. You know, it became my paideia. It was the water I was swimming in all the time, and I thought, must be
Yeah.
right. You
I
know,
think it is
you have to
right.
accept it. You just, you know, why am I
Yeah,
fighting this? It's true.
it's true. And once you see that it's true, everything makes an awful lot more sense, doesn't it? You know, when you see like the so for example, sticking with COVID for now, the way that money drove things was far more than just a company got rich. You know, people were not doing things because of the pursuit of money. And I sort of think of it as being like molecules in the wind, like each one is headed in the same direction. It's only a molecule, but it's going in that direction. It can become a gale force. And so, you know, with everybody thinking only of their careers and their money, then they all end up pushing in that direction. And you can't explain that from a human perspective because that's too great. It's just far too big to explain without using a term like evil as a kind of overall driver of what's making everybody going in the wrong direction together, because that's not a human thing. Humans can't make that happen. They're not strong enough, they're not clever enough, it's not from a human thing. And so that word evil, I think, is a very helpful way to describe that phenomenon. And then furthermore, you know, along this way, I've been exposed to all sorts of other things that some of which I've been interested in my response to them. So, for example, when people tell stories about sort of corruption and paedophilia, right, those stories make me want to run away. I don't want to see it. I don't want to see it. And I focus on my reaction to that a lot because I think that's the same way people are responding to things that I'm saying. They don't want to hear them. And it's the same fundamentally of just looking away and pretending it's all right when it's not. And that's not an acceptable way to behave. We can't be chicken. We have to be braver about looking at evil and calling it what it is.
It must be. It must surely be an unintended consequence. Trudy and I, my wife and I, we talk all the time about unintended consequences. It's become a, you know, it's become a touchstone for us in many ways, and it's surely an unintended consequence that this has happened. Because what you're describing, what you know, what and my reply to you, I hear it all the time, and I just live in a you know, normal life in a normal town, and the number of people that are expressing this as an experience, I think nobody saw this coming. This is so. The number of people, you know, Russell Brand, you know, famously has gone on this, you know, this journey of faith. Another friend of mine that I came into contact, you'll know, Eva Vlaringerbroek,
Yeah.
you know, has now confirmed. I mean, I don't know that she wasn't an atheist, but I don't think she was ever particularly focused. But she's, you know, I attended her confirmation as a Catholic, and many other people besides, you know, whose names maybe wouldn't resonate. But many of the letters, people talked about this being the time of apocalypse, which is the time of things being revealed. And
Well, yeah.
when you kind of, on the face of it, it sounds like the introduction to a film, like The Omen or something. You think, what are we dealing with here? This is archaic language. But once you just open up to it and you think, it is. Stuff is
Yeah.
being brought out into the open here. Why am I fighting it? Just go with it. And that can't
Yes.
have been intentional on the part of the people that were just out there trying to bring in, a mind control, you know, using a fear of a virus as the, you know, as the catalyst.
Yeah. No, I think that whole thing about the word apocalypse meaning revealing is actually quite it's quite reassuring, isn't it? Because it sounds so terrifying otherwise. And actually revealing is just beautiful. It's a beautiful thing for the truth to come out. And you know, obviously we have to keep fighting for it. It's not like it's just gonna, you know, you have to keep speaking it and keep saying it. But I'm actually very excited to see some more truths come out. And I don't think you can put lids on these things. You know, they try obviously, but there's always that sort of negative, the opposite effect when you try and censor things, that people do want to know it ultimately, and over time it will come out.
Do you think science can be reacquainted with faith or religion in that way that you're, can that be could that be a universal panacea for the ills of science?
I don't. Right, okay. Yes, I do. I think that science is completely compatible with faith. I don't think there's a problem to be bridged there, and I think that people, taking metaphors literally is quite an immature way to dismiss faith, really. But in terms of it solving the problems of science, I think you need, yes, right. As soon as you've got a God above you and you've got some more humility in your life, that would actually do a lot for science, a huge amount for science. And when there's a sort of problem of the sort of machoism and control within science as well, which a little bit of trying to all work together to the same goal would, potentially help. As in our aim here is to have truth rather than to have my next promotion. That would be good, wouldn't it? So yeah, I think it could. I think it could absolutely help with a lot of the problems.
And I mean, surely it could be that. I mean, it's not a tool for the same job. I don't mean that, but surely science or scientists would accept that science in the 300 or so years or whatever that we've had the scientific method, Francis Bacon and all of the rest of it, it has answered. It describes what the universe is without a doubt. From the macro to the micro, in the quantum theory and all of the rest of it, it tells us what, but it doesn't and wouldn't really endeavour to tell why. Science we don't experience life in a scientific way. You can understand that water is hydrogen and oxygen in bonded chemically, but that's not going to get you to what it feels like to drink it or what it feels like to swim in it. We have an experiential relationship with reality that science doesn't really address. And I think scientists who are awake to that side, whether you call it religion or faith or anything else, it's a much more three-dimensional way of seeking to perceive the true texture of reality, I would have thought.
Absolutely. And there's also, even within science itself, there's a whole load of things that are just astonishingly beautiful. That things like the amino acid sequences that are retained across all living organisms, and the sort of the way that that's coded is beautiful.
Tell me, paint me a picture. As a non-scientist.
Okay, so every protein is made up of building blocks, and those building blocks each are represented by 3 letters in the DNA code sequence. And there's more than one 3-letter option that can be translated that way. But essentially, you've got this language. You've got these letters becoming words, if you like. And so you might think that each animal would have its own language, right? Because they will all evolve separately. But we're all using the same language. That's beautiful. That is a beautiful thing. And then we've also got, these vast millions of years of existence of our planet. And there was a point at which life began that, you can have as a guess when that was. And when life began, do you know how molecules have dimers? So you can have like a left-handed and a right-handed mirror image of a molecule, but they're the same constructs. They're both hands, but one's left and one's right.
Okay.
So that's true for each of the amino acid molecules. And the whole of our Earth is using the left dimers. There is no life that uses the right-sided version. Like, well, we've had all of these millions and millions of years to have a version with the right-sided one. Where is it? Why did life only be one?
What does that mean, Claire? What does that mean? That's the first time anyone's ever said that to me. What does that mean if there's only one-handedness? What does that?
That was a slightly weird metaphor to use.
But
it means that life began once on our planet. It began, and it hasn't begun since.
Right. So it's like it's just like one spark.
Well, it's just that
there was a time
when like if you wanted to be an atheist about it, you'd say, well, there was a time when the conditions were right once to have this happen. But if you want to believe in God around it, you say, well, that was when life began. Life began then. and there was something more than just the conditions being right. It was the beginning of life then happening at that time.
How can life begin without there being an underlying intention? Scientifically, why do you go from a rock that's lifeless to life without intent?
So that is a question. So that we can tell you a lot of the story from a science point of view. So you can go from a cell to humans through the evolution story. That story works as
a cell's alive. A cell's alive.
A cell is incredibly complicated. They are incredibly complicated. They're not simple things by any means. And they've got all within them these little organelles, which are like organs of their own, that each of them has to develop and cooperate with each other. And so you have to get to the point of a cell requires a huge amount more time. And then at the very beginning of all of that, you've got this problem that you've got nucleic acid sequences that need to be able to replicate in order to have a system from which you can start to build a cell. And then you really get into trouble because they're so codependent that in order to have a working system of replication, you need to have protection of these very fragile molecules which UV light can destroy. So you've got this kind of idea of the primordial soup where the UV light's being hindered from entering, which protects it at that period of time. So that's your atheist argument for why life began only then. Is because that's the only time when they were protected from UV light. But of course, deep down the ocean, that's all the time.
It's so refreshing to me to be able to stray into territory like this with a bona fide credentialed working scientist. I wonder how many of your colleagues are like this, that are ambivalent, let's say, about whether it's just atheistic science or whether it's something else. Are you
an increasing number, I'd say. And it's really, I also really enjoy these conversations, and I've not really had them much, the kind of philosophical conversations about life with my atheist medic friends. It just, just like, we know the answers, let's not talk about it. Which is, just very narrow.
To sort of bring it back around again to where we started, when I said you had a life of before that you described, and you thought you were going to work in AI and all of the rest of it, and then it has been replaced by this life. And is this the better? Is this the better place?
It is a better place, but it's not a place I'd have wanted. If you described it to me, I wouldn't have wanted it. So my previous situation, I was
brilliant.
I was constantly worried about money in the future. I always worried about money, security in the future, and yet I kind of knew where to go to get those things. And now I just live way more in the present, and I don't know what the future holds, and I'm not worried about it anymore. So that it is perverse, but I'd rather be in the situation where I'm comfortable with that.
I love the idea that you'd prefer to be here, but if you'd been offered it, you wouldn't have chosen it. There's a real paradox in there somewhere.
Yeah, I wouldn't have done at all. And as I say, I really don't know what's next. I really don't know what's next. I don't know if I've burnt all my bridges, but I'd go back and burn them again if so.
That's brilliant. Dr. Clare Craig, I'm going to leave that there and let you go on with your unexpected life. And we'll pick this up again some other day. Thank you, Clare.